Hey everyone, this is David Brown with the update from the Ashland Hawk Watch with highlights from September 1st through the 6th, 2024. The Ashland Hawk Watch is located in Hockessin, Delaware, and I have returned for my 8th season as the hawk counter. There are a lot of bird photos to go through, so let's jump right into it. One of the highlights from the morning of the first day was this warbler. We see that it's yellow underneath with some streaking to the sides and eye arcs. This is a prairie warbler, and it looks like it caught a nice tasty treat. We've been enjoying watching this species on most days so far. This is a large woodpecker with black and white highlights to the wing. This is a pileated woodpecker, or pileated if you prefer. All right, here we go with our first raptor. We see that this bird has very pointed wings, so perhaps we should be thinking falcon right away. And we see that the bird has dark streaking underneath. We see some banding to the tail, making this a merlin. Here we have a bird that's mostly dark, but it has a very small head, so we should be thinking vulture rather than eagle. And we see that this bird has a very short tail, and it's very squared off, and in fact the toes are sticking out beyond the tip of the tail. And we see that the white is only here at the wingtips rather than the whole trailing edge to the wing. So whenever you have a dark vulture like this with the white at the wingtips in a very compact shape, that makes it a black vulture. Compare that to this bird. We have another vulture here, but we can see a reddish head. We see a completely silver or light colored trailing edge to the wings and a little bit more of a lanky shape, wings held up into a bit of a V, longer tail. This is an adult turkey vulture. Here we have another large dark raptor, but this one has a larger head, although it's hard to see with the overexposed photo, making this an eagle rather than a vulture. We see a lot of splotchy white throughout the wings and underside to the body, making this an immature bald eagle. And keep in mind, we won't see any golden eagles probably until the second half of the season. Anytime from mid-October on, we can see goldens, but it's usually the last week of October into early November. So for the first half of the season, we're sort of defaulting to bald eagle for all of the eagles that we see. Here we have a raptor that has that typical hawk shape to it. Overall, it's very pale. We don't see a dark trailing edge to the wings, just very light colored wings. And underneath, it's very clean to the upper breast with a very distinct belly band. And we can sort of make out dark patagial bars here, making this a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Here we have another juvenile buteo, but this is a different species. And the main differences I'm seeing are, if we look at the streaking, we don't have that very distinct belly band there in the middle of the underside. It's more streaking that starts all the way on the upper breast. And the other thing to point out is the wingtip area. We see that this bird has very squared off wingtips, and we see that there's translucent crescents near the wingtips, making this a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. Here we have another hawk, but this is a different shape than those buteos we were looking at. This bird has a much longer tail, putting it in the accipiter genus. And overall, we see a large head, very long, straight wings, a long tail with a rounded tip, and streaking concentrated here on the upper breast, making this a juvenile Cooper's hawk. Here we have a very distinctive raptor. We can see it's large and lanky with those skinny angular wings. Overall, it's white to the underside of the body and black and white on the wings. This is an osprey, and osprey are very common to see in the early part of the season. And even when they're high up overhead, just from that lanky shape that they have, they're easy to distinguish from anything else that we're seeing migrate. Here's another hawk, and based off of that typical hawk shape with kind of a medium length tail, this is in the buteo genus, and we're seeing dark patagial bars here in the shoulders, as well as a belly band here. Again, clean breast, but a distinct belly band, and no dark trailing edge to the wings, making this a juvenile red-tailed hawk. And you can see the juveniles do not have a red tail. It's more of a brownish tail with some thin banding to it. Here's a photo that's lower quality, but there's still enough for us to be able to identify this bird. Again, from the shape, we're seeing a buteo. And the other field marks that I'm seeing, we can't really make out much about the underside or a belly band or anything like that, but I'm seeing that the wingtips look somewhat pointed. We see that on both wings. And also the tail patterning, we see a very dark tip and then some thin banding. And that's the typical plumage for a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And this is a species that we're going to see hopefully many thousands of in the coming weeks. Last year, the really big day was on September 20th, where we had nearly 10,000 of them. And that was a record day and a record season, but usually we'll get a day with a couple thousand of these. And so this is one that a lot of people look forward to in the early part of the season. Here's a raptor that I think everyone is able to identify. We see a large raptor with a brown body and wings with a white head and white tail. This is an adult bald eagle. Here we have the upper side of a hawk. From that overall shape, we should be thinking buteo, but which one is it? Well, one of the hints is if we look at this paler section to the wing, we don't see just the translucent crescents that we would see on a red-shouldered hawk, but rather we see more of a pale square, and that's typical for this species, juvenile red-tailed hawk. And here's the underside of the same bird. Quite a difference, right? Completely brown on the top side, but from underneath they look extremely pale. And again, for the red tails, you're looking for the dark patagial bars and the belly band. Both the juveniles and adults have that feature, but on the juveniles we're seeing a light trailing edge to the wing rather than a dark, bold trailing edge to the wing that adults would show. And the tail looks more whitish or brownish with some thin streaking rather than the bold red tail that the adults show. Here we have a somewhat lanky looking raptor that's brown on top with some speckling. We see a white head with a black line through the eye. This is a juvenile osprey, and we know it's a juvenile because of that speckling to the upper wing. And here we have the underside of what I think is the same osprey. So again, just very thin wings, very lanky appearance overall, and black and white patterning. Here we have a bird that's not a raptor, but can we guess what it is? Well, it's very white underneath with some black wingtips. Perhaps we should be thinking of gulls. And we see that this bird has a dark head, although it appears to be molting out of the dark breeding plumage, perhaps into the winter plumage. And this is actually a laughing gull, which is fairly uncommon to see at the Hawk Watch. I think I've seen it a few times over the years. Certainly a very common species in coastal Delaware in the summertime, but kind of uncommon to see all the way up in the Piedmont inland at Ashland. On this bird, we see overall it's dark on the underside of the body. We see a red featherless head, and we see a light silvery trailing edge to the wings, but we don't see that longer tail that we would expect to see on a turkey vulture. Well, in fact, this is a turkey vulture, but it is missing its tail, so it's more of a flying wing. And we've either been seeing this bird over and over, or there's multiple turkey vultures in the area that are missing their tails. And it's something that we see occasionally, but they seem to be able to fly pretty well, even lacking its tail. Here we have another vulture, and again, we see a silvery trailing edge to the wings, but on this bird, we don't see a red head. We see more of a grayish or black head, and this is actually a juvenile turkey vulture. They don't have the red head yet. When they're young, they have more of a grayish head. And we can see that this bird is very clean looking. If you look at the wings, all of the feathers are the same age. It's a bird that was born this summer, so no molt yet, no different ages of feathers. It's a very clean looking bird. Here we have a hawk. Looking at the overall shape, we should be thinking buteo. This looks like a small, compact buteo. We see pointed wingtips where the wingtips are only made up of 4 feathers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or on this wing, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, on the tail, as we saw on one of these earlier, we see that black tip to the tail and then thin, narrower banding as we go up. Some streaking to the underside, but hard to tell from this photo. But this is another juvenile broad-winged hawk. Here we have another turkey vulture, but this one is an adult. You can see that reddish head, and you can also see that it's not as clean looking in the wings as that juvenile was. You can see a lot of feather wear and perhaps different ages of feathers as well. Here we have a large dark raptor. We see a relatively large head. We see a dark underside to the body, but a lot of white here in the wings, especially in the wing pit area. This is a juvenile bald eagle, and you can see the completely even trailing edge to the wings. Once these feathers start to be replaced, the new feathers that come in are slightly shorter, where the second and third years have more of a ragged pattern to the trailing edge. But these juveniles are pretty clean looking on the trailing edge to the wings. Here we have another hawk. We should be thinking buteo on this one from the overall shape. And again, we see a very distinctive belly band. Again, clean upper breast, but a distinctive belly band. You can see the dark patagial bars here in the shoulder, making this a red-tailed hawk. Overall, it's pretty light underneath. We can see some light shining through, not as crescents near the wingtips, but more as squares here in the inner primary feathers. We do not see a bold trailing edge to the wings or a red tail, so we know this is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Compare that to this Buteo. On this one, we don't see that distinctive belly band, but we see streaking that starts all the way on the upper breast and then goes down. And if we look near the wingtips, we see more squared off wings, and we see those translucent crescents near the wingtip. And really, when we're looking at distant Buteos, a lot of times on the red-shouldered hawks like this one, we are picking them out based on those very distinctive translucent crescents. You can really see them from pretty far away. Also notice the way they hold their wings. They kind of curve them forward a little bit. That's another distinctive shape that the red shoulders show more so than the broad wings or the red tails. Here we have a small juvenile Buteo that flew in and landed in a tree, but we had already identified it as a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And the juvenile broadwings are extremely similar to the juvenile red shoulders. When they're perched, they can look almost identical. In flight, they're a lot easier to tell based on the shape of the wingtips and those translucent crescents that the red shoulders have. But this was a juvenile broad-winged hawk. Here we have a somewhat lanky looking raptor. We can see it's got long, somewhat skinny wings and a somewhat long tail. Overall, it's kind of orangey or tan to the underside. It's not really white. It's got more of warmer tones to it. And if we could see the face a little better, we would see an owl-like facial disc. This is a juvenile northern harrier. Here we have a large dark raptor that you should be able to identify as a bald eagle. We can see this one's not quite a full adult yet. You see it still has some black here to the tip of the tail, and there's still some white highlights to the underside of the wings. So maybe next year this one would look like a full adult. Here we have a lanky black and white raptor high overhead. This is an osprey. Here we have a very dark, compact looking raptor where the light color is only out here at the wingtips, and it has a very short squared off tail, although this one looks a little messed up, maybe molting. This is a black vulture. Here we have a bulky looking Buteo. We can see that distinctive belly band as well as the dark patagial bars, so we know this is a red-tailed hawk. Overall, the wings look very light in color. We can see some light shining through, no bold trailing edge to the wings, so we know that this is a juvenile, even though we can't really see the tail that well. Here we have a large dark bird, completely black. So this is actually not a raptor, but this is a corvid, and it was a large corvid, and if we look at the shape of that tail, it's wedge-shaped, or I like to think of it as diamond shape. We see it go out like this and then cut into more of a point and back. This is a common raven. This has been a very common sight recently, especially as we get into the afternoon and the raptors are up really high. A lot of time we're just scanning the sky and trying to scan across any cloud that we can find to help us spot birds, but this shape is distinctive to the osprey. Here we have two hawks flying together, and we can use that to compare the size of them. Let's start with the one on the right. We see a smaller hawk, and we see it has a very long tail, so we should be thinking accipiter on this one. We see teardrop streaking that's concentrated on the upper breast. This is a juvenile Cooper's hawk. The bird on the left here is larger and doesn't have as long of a tail, although maybe it's a little deceptive from the angle of this photo. But we should be thinking Buteo on this one rather than accipiter. And if we look at the wingtip here, we see it's very squared off. And if we go to this photo from the same sequence, we see on that left bird that we have translucent crescents, making it a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. So juvenile red-shouldered hawk on the left and juvenile Cooper's hawk on the right. Here again, we have two birds in a photo, and the bird on the left, just from the tail, we should be able to identify as an adult red-tailed hawk, but also notice the dark belly band and the dark patagial bars. And also remember that the adult red tails have that dark trailing edge to the wings. And the bird on the right is a crow, probably an American crow, although we have also been getting some fish crows. If you've been going out in the morning looking for warblers, perhaps you've seen one of these. This is not a warbler, but rather this is a larger species of bird. We see that it's completely yellow except for black wings with no wing bars or anything. This is a scarlet tanager. And you might say, well, wait a second, I see scarlet tanagers in the spring and summer and they're bright red. But all of the scarlet tanagers are yellowish in the fall. You may see some that still have a little bit of red as the males are molting into their non-breeding plumage, but all the scarlet tanagers I've been seeing recently have been completely yellow like this. So keep an eye out for the large yellow bird mixed in with the warblers. Here we have a hawk that's shaped like a flying cross. We see a large head that sticks out, long straight wings, and a long tail. Whenever we see a flying cross, we should be thinking Accipiter genus. And on this bird, the tail isn't going to be as much of a help because it's so messed up. It looks like it's missing some feathers, although it looks like we can see that the outer tail feather is shorter than the central ones. And we see that it's got teardrop streaking concentrated on the upper breast, which is a good field mark for juvenile Cooper's hawk. Here we have another juvenile Cooper's hawk. Again, notice that shape where they have a large head that really sticks out. And again, a long tail. And on this bird, you can see that the outer tail feathers are shorter. You can see this one's here especially sticking out, and it's much shorter than the central tail feathers. That's more typical of the Cooper's hawk. Usually on a sharp-shinned hawk, the outer tail feathers would be approximately the same length as the central ones. And on this Cooper's hawk, we see that it's a little more heavily marked than the other one. It's teardrop streaking that's more heavy on the upper breast, but we see that the streaking on this one goes down pretty much almost all the way to the undertail coverts, which is a field mark that a lot of times we're looking for juvenile northern goshawks. So sometimes you have to be a little bit careful, but this bird's pretty classic Cooper's hawk, and northern goshawk would be extremely rare here in Delaware, and it's a bird we would expect more late in the season. Here's another compact buteo with somewhat pointed wingtips. This is another juvenile broad-winged hawk. Take a second and see if you can figure out what this one is. It looks like a flying cross with a large head that sticks out, very straight wings, and a long tail that looks like it has a rounded tip. This is another juvenile Cooper's hawk. Here's another one that I think you should be able to figure out by now. Here we see a very classic hawk shape. We should be thinking buteo. We see that dark belly band. We see dark patagial bars. So we should be thinking red-tailed hawk. And we see some translucent windows here in the wings, and we do not see a very bold trailing edge to the wings. And we don't see a bright red tail, rather a brownish tail with thin banding. This is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Here we have a black and white raptor that's somewhat lanky looking. This is an osprey. And again, we see that speckling to the top side of the wings. And here you can see that it's actually white at the tip of each individual feather that gives that appearance. And you can see that white head with the black line through the eye. This is a juvenile osprey. And again, we're calling it a juvenile based on this speckling. Here's another one you should be able to get. On this one, we see that it has a red tail. So that should be your first hint that this is a red-tailed hawk. And again, we see a dark belly band, although on this one it's very small. It's not as big and bold. There's a lot of variation to the plumages of red tails. But we also see those dark patagial bars here in the shoulder. And again, that's something that broadwings and red shoulders don't show. So anytime you're seeing these dark patagial bars, that's enough to call it as a red tail. So dark patagial bars and belly band make it a red-tailed hawk, and the adults have this orangish red tail and the dark trailing edge to the wings. Here's another bird where we see the dark belly band as well as the dark patagial bars. So again, another red-tailed hawk, but on this one, notice how light the wings are. You get the light shining through in the windows on the inner primaries, no bold dark trailing edge to the wings, and no red tail. So this is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Here's a somewhat lanky looking raptor. We see a long tail, and we see long wings that have pointed wingtips, very orangey underneath, and that makes this a juvenile northern harrier. And you can sort of see that owl-like facial disc they have as well. And for the juveniles, we're seeing that it's a lot of orange color underneath and very unmarked here in the patagial area. When we start seeing the adult females, we're going to see a lot of streaking here to the upper breast, as well as more markings here in the patagial area. Here we have a bird with very pointed wingtips. We should be thinking falcon. We see that dark streaking underneath as well as some white banding on a dark tail, making this a merlin. Anytime you have a small dark falcon that has a big attitude and is a very strong fast flyer, that's going to be a merlin. When we're seeing kestrels, they look lighter underneath. They're more buoyant and they just don't have that mean attitude like the merlins do. Here we have a somewhat large flycatcher with a gray head, A lot of yellow here to the belly and a rufous tail. And if you look in your field guide, you might see several species that look very similar to this, but there's only one that is found in our area, and that is the great crested flycatcher. Here we have two birds. If we look at the one here on top, we see that it's got a bluish gray head, a lot of brownish red here to the upper breast, and a white belly. The bird down below looks like the same species in terms of the shape and size and everything, but we see this one's got some more speckling to it. These are eastern bluebirds, and the top one is an adult and the bottom one is a juvenile. Here we have a yellow bird that stopped at our bird feeder, and we can see that it has a black forehead as well as black wings, making this an American goldfinch. But this bird has something wrong with the back of its head. It's completely missing the feathers on the back of the head, some sort of injury, not typical to see. Looks like it has a big bald spot. Here we have a hawk high overhead that has a long tail, but if we look at the overall shape of this bird, it's not big and lanky like we were seeing on the Cooper's hawks, but rather this bird has a relatively small head, more shorter, rounded looking wings, and a very squared off tip to the tail, making this a sharp-shinned hawk. Here's a hawk that was checking us out as we were checking him out. We see a very bright reddish-orange tail, making this an adult red-tailed hawk. But again, notice that dark belly band and dark patagial bars, as well as the dark trilling edge to the wings that the adults show. Here we have a swallow that's pale underneath. We see some blue to the head and maybe a reddish throat, and we see a forked tail. This is a barn swallow. Here's a raptor that, based on the distance, we can't make out too much about. It looks sort of brownish overall, not a bright white by any means. We see a relatively long tail, and we see kind of long, skinny, pointed wings. And this is the silhouette of a northern harrier. It looks like it's probably another juvenile. Here we have a hawk with kind of a medium-length tail. We don't see a distinct belly band, rather it's some diffuse, blobby-looking streaking underneath. But the thing that should catch your eye are the translucent crescents near the wingtips. This is a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. Here we have a gray bird with very long, skinny, pointed wings, and we see that perhaps the most distinctive field mark is this white band here near the wingtip. And this is a hawk in name only. Actually, this is a nightjar, or a goatsucker if you prefer. This is a common nighthawk, and they're migrating through in pretty good numbers recently. Although I've been looking outside at dusk and not seeing too many, but this is the time of year that we get them. And actually today was the first day that we had any during the Hawk Watch period. But as the season gets going and I stay out a little bit later, we'll start to see more and more of these. Usually I've been only going until 4 since it's pretty slow to start off the season. But as we get into the peak of the broadwings, I'll be staying until 5 or even 6 or later on some days. And that's when you tend to see the nighthawks. Sometimes they'll come out on cloudy days as well, but sometimes you'll see them just randomly in the middle of the day when it's full sunshine. They just kind of cruise around catching and eating bugs. They have a very distinctive flight style. They kind of swoop around, and it's almost hard to believe they can fly with wings that skinny. But again, look for these very distinctive white bands near the wingtips. And if we take a quick look at hawk count, you can see our totals from the first 6 days of the season: 35, 26, 34, 12, 18, 20. So far we've had 145 birds, but the most we've had on any day was 35. But over the next couple weeks, that will definitely begin to pick up, especially as we hit mid-September and come into the peak of the broad-winged hawks, where we can get thousands of them on a good day. So definitely stay tuned, and I hope you can come out and visit us sometime at the Ashland Hawk Watch. From Lyco Birds, this is David Brown. Thanks for watching.